In the spring of 1889, the lawyers of Richmond, Virginia discovered something that would shake the foundations of the city's oldest families. The Worthington Estate, a sprawling plantation that had stood as a monument to Southern aristocracy for over a century, had been quietly purchased in its entirety by a man the family had once owned as property. His name was Elijah Worthington, and the 40-year journey that led him from the auction block to owning the very land where his mother had died in chains would become the most extraordinary story of patience, cunning, and calculated triumph in American history. Before we dive into how Elijah Worthington accomplished the impossible, transforming himself from human property into the master of a 1,000-acre empire, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're uncovering the buried stories that history tried to forget, and you won't want to miss a single revelation. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if this story gives you chills, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let's discover how one man spent 4 decades plotting the perfect revenge, not with violence, but with something far more devastating to the people who had destroyed his family. The story begins not with Elijah, but with his mother, a woman named Delilah, who arrived at the Worthington plantation in 1841 under circumstances that the family never spoke about publicly. She had been purchased at auction in New Orleans, selected specifically by Margaret Worthington, the plantation matriarch, who needed a personal maid with refined skills in sewing and household management. What Margaret didn't know, or perhaps didn't care to acknowledge, was that Delilah had once been free, the daughter of a successful black businessman in Charleston who had built a modest fortune through careful investments and strategic partnerships with white merchants who valued profit over prejudice. Delilah's fall from freedom to slavery was the result of a legal technicality exploited by unscrupulous men who had decided that her father's wealth would be better served in their own pockets. When her father died in 1840, white business partners who owed him substantial debts simply claimed that all documentation of those debts had been fraudulent, and that as a black man, he had no legal right to enter into binding contracts with white citizens in the first place. Within 6 months, everything her father had built was seized, sold, or stolen, and Delilah found herself standing on an auction block in New Orleans, her entire world reduced to a price tag and the inspection of potential buyers who examined her teeth like she was livestock. Margaret Worthington paid $1,200 for Delilah, a substantial sum that reflected her obvious education and bearing. The plantation mistress prided herself on surrounding herself with refined servants, believing that the quality of one's slaves reflected one's own social standing. Delilah was installed in the main house, given responsibilities that included managing Margaret's extensive wardrobe, supervising other household slaves, and occasionally reading aloud from books that Margaret found too tedious to read herself, but wanted to appear knowledgeable about in social situations. It was during these reading sessions that Delilah first encountered Marcus Worthington, Margaret's youngest son, who at 24 years old represented everything that was simultaneously admirable and contemptible about the Southern gentleman class. Marcus had been educated at the University of Virginia, where he had studied law, philosophy, and the economic theories that justified the plantation system. He possessed a sharp mind, impeccable manners, and absolutely no moral compass when it came to the enslaved people who surrounded him. The relationship that developed between Delilah and Marcus followed a pattern as old as slavery itself, and as shameful as any crime sanctioned by law. Marcus, attracted to Delilah's intelligence and beauty, used his position of absolute power to make her his mistress, a relationship that was rape by any honest definition, though the legal system of the time refused to acknowledge that enslaved women had any right to refuse their master's advances. Delilah, trapped in a situation where resistance would mean punishment or sail away from the relative comfort of housework into the brutal conditions of field labour, accepted her fate with the same grim pragmatism that allowed millions of enslaved people to survive daily degradation. When Delilah became pregnant in the summer of 1842, Margaret Worthington's reaction was predictable and vicious. The plantation mistress, who had turned a blind eye to her son's exploitation of enslaved women, suddenly became outraged at the physical evidence of that exploitation. She demanded that Delilah be sold immediately, removed from the plantation before the birth of a child who would serve as a permanent reminder of Marcus's indiscretion. But Marcus, displaying a rare moment of something that might have been conscience or might have been mere possessiveness, refused his mother's demand. He argued that Delilah was too valuable as a household manager to be sold, and that the child, when born, would simply be raised in the slave quarters like any other plantation baby. This decision, made for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine care for Delilah or their unborn child, would set in motion events that would ultimately destroy the Worthington family's legacy. Elijah was born in March of 1843, in a small cabin behind the main plantation house, delivered by the plantation's midwife while his mother lay on a rough wooden bed that represented the vast distance between his father's world and his own. Marcus acknowledged the child only in the most minimal way, ensuring that Delilah and the baby received slightly better food and accommodations than other slaves, but never giving any indication that he considered Elijah to be his son in any meaningful sense. Under the laws of Virginia, Elijah's status followed his mother's condition, meaning that despite having a white father who owned 1,000 acres and dozens of slaves, Elijah himself was property, valued and inventoried along with the plantation's horses and cotton gins. Delilah, determined that her son would have every possible advantage she could provide within their impossible circumstances, began Elijah's education before he could walk. She taught him letters and numbers in secret, using ashes to write on wooden boards that could be quickly wiped clean if anyone approached. She taught him about the world beyond the plantation, sharing memories of her father's business acumen and the strategies he had used to accumulate wealth in a society designed to prevent exactly that kind of success. Most importantly, she taught him patience, drilling into him the understanding that visible intelligence could be dangerous for a slave, and that real power came from knowing when to show what you knew and when to appear ignorant. As Elijah grew, his resemblance to Marcus became increasingly obvious, creating an uncomfortable situation that Margaret Worthington tried to resolve through deliberate cruelty. She assigned Elijah to the most degrading tasks she could devise, forcing him to empty chamber pots, scrub floors, and perform work that emphasized his enslaved status. Marcus, uncomfortable with the living reminder of his own moral failures, largely ignored Elijah's existence, treating the boy with the same distant condescension he showed all slaves. But Elijah was watching, learning, and remembering every detail of how the plantation operated. By age 10, he had memorized the names and faces of every person who visited the estate, noting their business relationships with the Worthington family and the subtle hierarchies of power and obligation that governed their interactions. He understood which neighbours were in debt to the Worthingtons and which ones held mortgages or liens on Worthington property. He learned the rhythms of planting and harvest, the profit margins on different crops, and the eternal struggle to maintain profitability when cotton prices fluctuated and labour costs had to be balanced against the investment in purchasing and maintaining enslaved workers. The education Delilah provided, combined with Elijah's own observations, created something unusual and dangerous in the antebellum South. An enslaved person who understood the economic systems that sustained his bondage, and who began to see vulnerabilities in the apparently invincible structure of plantation aristocracy. When Elijah was 12 years old, everything changed. A cholera outbreak swept through Richmond and the surrounding countryside, killing hundreds within weeks. The disease struck the Worthington plantation with devastating speed, claiming the lives of Margaret Worthington, Marcus's older brother Robert, and ultimately Delilah herself. Elijah watched his mother die in the slave quarters, denied access to the same medical care that was failing to save the white members of the household, but separated even in death by the rigid hierarchies of race and status. In her final hours, as fever consumed her body, and her mind wandered between present suffering and past memories, Delilah gripped Elijah's hand with surprising strength and made him promise something that would guide the rest of his life. She made him swear that he would not seek revenge through violence, that he would not become the kind of man who destroyed himself trying to destroy his enemies. Instead, she extracted a promise that he would use his intelligence, patience, and understanding of white society to achieve something far more complete than mere vengeance. She made him promise that he would take everything from the Worthingtons, using the very systems they trusted to protect them as the instruments of their downfall. Elijah buried his mother in the slave cemetery at the far edge of the plantation property, in an unmarked grave among dozens of other enslaved people who had died building Worthington wealth. Standing there in the rain, watching white overseers fill in the earth over the only person who had ever loved him, 13-year-old Elijah made a vow that would shape every decision he made for the next 40 years. He would own this land. He would own the main house where his father had lived in comfort while Elijah's mother slaved in bondage. He would own every acre, every building, every resource that represented the Worthington legacy. And he would do it legally, using contracts and deeds and all the official paperwork that white society believed could never be turned against them. The first step in Elijah's impossible plan required him to make himself valuable enough that he would never be sold away from the Worthington plantation. In the aftermath of the cholera epidemic, with the plantation's workforce depleted and its management in chaos, Elijah began demonstrating skills that made him increasingly indispensable to the plantation's operation. He had spent years watching the plantation's bookkeeper, an elderly white man named Silas Crawford, who managed the complex records of expenses, production, and sales that kept the plantation financially viable. When Crawford died of a stroke in 1856, Marcus Worthington faced a serious problem. None of the neighbouring planters could recommend a reliable bookkeeper who would relocate to manage another man's affairs, and Marcus himself lacked both the interest and the aptitude for the detailed numerical work required to run a large plantation efficiently. Elijah, now 14 years old and already demonstrating unusual mathematical abilities, carefully positioned himself as the solution to Marcus's problem. He began by correcting obvious errors in the plantation's records, presenting his findings to Marcus with a combination of deference and competence that suggested capability without threatening white authority. When Marcus needed to prepare tax documents for the county assessor, Elijah produced calculations that were both accurate and formatted in ways that impressed the assessor enough to comment on the plantation's excellent record-keeping. Over the following months, Elijah became the plantation's de facto bookkeeper, managing financial records, tracking crop production, and even corresponding with cotton factors in Richmond, who handled the sale of Worthington cotton in northern markets. This role gave Elijah something unprecedented for an enslaved person: comprehensive knowledge of the plantation's finances, including its debts, assets, and the intricate network of loans and obligations that connected the Worthingtons to Richmond's banking establishment. What Elijah discovered through his access to these records was both encouraging and alarming. Encouraging because the Worthington plantation, despite its impressive appearance, was deeply in debt, with multiple mortgages and liens securing loans that Marcus had taken to maintain his lifestyle and to recover from poor cotton harvests. Alarming because if the plantation failed financially, all its assets, including Elijah himself, would be sold to satisfy creditors, destroying any chance of achieving his long-term goal. Elijah's solution was counterintuitive and brilliant. Instead of allowing the plantation to collapse under its debt burden, he began working to make it more profitable, implementing efficiencies in crop rotation, livestock management, and labour allocation that gradually improved the estate's financial position. He did this not out of loyalty or any desire to help the Worthingtons succeed, but because a functioning plantation that could service its debts was a plantation that would remain intact, giving him time to accumulate the resources he would need to eventually purchase it. The American Civil War, which began in April 1861, created both opportunities and dangers for Elijah's plans. as Confederate forces demanded supplies and labor for the war effort, plantation economics were thrown into chaos. Cotton prices fluctuated wildly as Union blockades disrupted trade, and the conscription of white men for military service left many plantations undermanned and poorly managed. Marcus Worthington, despite his age, volunteered for Confederate service in 1862, motivated more by social pressure than patriotic fervor. Before departing for the army, he made a decision that would prove catastrophic for his family's long-term interests. He granted Elijah increased authority to manage plantation affairs during his absence, including the power to make financial decisions and to represent the estate in dealings with local merchants and Richmond banks. This arrangement, documented in papers filed with the county clerk to protect Marcus's interests while he was away at war, gave Elijah something he had never possessed before: legal authority to act on behalf of the Worthington estate in commercial transactions. The carefully worded documents, reviewed by a Richmond attorney who saw nothing unusual in a trusted slave being given limited powers to manage his master's affairs, would later become the foundation of Elijah's campaign to acquire the property. During the war years, while Marcus fought in Virginia campaigns that devastated Confederate forces, Elijah ran the plantation with an efficiency that impressed neighboring landowners and Richmond merchants alike. He negotiated favorable prices for supplies, found markets for crops despite wartime disruptions, and even began extending small loans to neighboring plantations that were struggling to survive the war's economic devastation. These loans, made using Worthington resources but documented in ways that created legal ambiguities about who exactly was extending the credit, began building a network of obligations that would prove valuable in years to come. But Elijah's most important wartime activity was completely invisible to the white community that surrounded him. Beginning in 1863, he began using his position and mobility to assist escaped slaves fleeing north through the Underground Railroad. His role was subtle but crucial. He provided information about safe routes, offered temporary shelter in unused plantation buildings, and occasionally provided forged travel papers that allowed fugitives to move through Confederate territory without being stopped by patrols. This dangerous work satisfied something in Elijah's soul, giving him a way to actively undermine the slave system while simultaneously building relationships with abolitionists and free black communities in the North who would remember his assistance when the war ended. Marcus Worthington returned from the Civil War in May 1865, 3 weeks after Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. He came back to a plantation that was still functioning, which made him one of the fortunate few among Virginia's planter class. But he also returned to a world that had been fundamentally transformed by the 13th Amendment's abolition of slavery. The entire economic foundation of plantation agriculture had collapsed, and Marcus, like thousands of other former slave owners, had to confront the reality that his supposed wealth had largely consisted of human beings who were now legally free. Elijah's emancipation should have marked the beginning of a new relationship between him and Marcus, one based on employment rather than ownership. Instead, Marcus made a decision that revealed both his racism and his economic desperation. He offered Elijah a sharecropping arrangement that was designed to keep the former slave in debt servitude, providing minimal compensation while extracting maximum labor. The contract Marcus proposed would have given Elijah a small percentage of crop revenue after extensive deductions for housing, food, equipment, and a dozen other charges that would ensure he never accumulated any significant capital. But Marcus had fundamentally misunderstood both the situation and the man he was dealing with. Elijah, now 22 years old and possessing comprehensive knowledge of the plantation's finances, politely declined the sharecropping offer and instead proposed an alternative arrangement that caught Marcus completely off guard. Elijah offered to continue managing the plantation's financial affairs for a salary of $500 per year, a sum that seemed outrageous to Marcus but which Elijah knew was far less than a white bookkeeper with equivalent skills would demand. More importantly, Elijah's proposal included provisions that gave him increasing authority over plantation operations, framed in language that suggested he would be acting as Marcus's agent, but which actually created legal structures that separated certain plantation assets into categories that Elijah would manage with minimal oversight. Marcus, desperate to maintain some semblance of his pre-war lifestyle and lacking any better alternative for managing the plantation's complex financial situation, accepted Elijah's terms. The contract they signed, drafted by Elijah and reviewed by a Richmond attorney who saw nothing unusual in its provisions, became the first piece of what would eventually be a comprehensive legal architecture that transferred the Worthington estate from master to former slave. The years between 1865 and 1875 were a period of extraordinary activity for Elijah, who was simultaneously running the plantation, building his own wealth, and constructing the elaborate framework that would allow him to eventually purchase the Worthington property. His strategy was multifaceted and patient, designed to avoid attracting attention while steadily undermining the Worthington family's economic position. The first element of Elijah's plan involved making himself absolutely indispensable to the plantation's operation. He managed every aspect of the estate's finances, maintained relationships with banks and merchants, and handled negotiations with the sharecroppers and wage labourers who had replaced the enslaved workforce. Marcus, who had never fully understood the complex economic calculations required to run a large agricultural operation, became increasingly dependent on Elijah's expertise. The former master spent his days drinking bourbon and complaining about the changes brought by Reconstruction, while his former slave actually ran the estate that bore the Worthington name. Simultaneously, Elijah began building his own separate economic base. He used his salary and his extensive knowledge of agricultural markets to engage in small-scale trading operations, buying and selling commodities in ways that generated steady profits. He extended loans to small farmers, both black and white, who needed capital to purchase seed or equipment, charging interest rates that were fair enough to maintain goodwill but substantial enough to accumulate capital. Within 5 years of emancipation, Elijah had saved over $3,000, an enormous sum for a formerly enslaved person and more liquid capital than many white families possessed in the economically devastated post-war South. But accumulating money was only part of Elijah's strategy. He also needed to acquire leverage over the Worthington family, creating conditions that would eventually force them to sell their property on terms favourable to him. This required a much more subtle and manipulative approach, one that would take advantage of Marcus's weaknesses and the changing political landscape of Reconstruction Virginia. Marcus Worthington's primary weakness was his complete inability to adjust to the post-war economic reality. He continued to spend money as if the plantation still generated the revenues it had produced during the slavery era, maintaining a lifestyle of expensive clothes, fine wines, and elaborate social events that the estate's actual income could not support. Elijah, who managed the plantation's finances, could have prevented this destructive spending by simply refusing to authorize expenditures. Instead, he carefully enabled Marcus's profligacy, extending credit on behalf of the estate and taking loans from Richmond banks using the plantation's assets as collateral. To any outside observer, Elijah appeared to be loyally serving his former master's interests by maintaining the appearance of Worthington prosperity. In reality, he was systematically loading the estate with debt that would eventually become impossible to service. By 1870, the Worthington plantation owed over $40,000 to various creditors, secured by mortgages and liens on virtually every asset the family owned. The debt burden was carefully calibrated, large enough to create serious financial strain, but not so large that creditors would immediately move to foreclose, which would have resulted in the property being sold at auction to whoever offered the highest bid. Elijah needed the Worthingtons to remain technically solvent but financially desperate, creating conditions where they would eventually be forced to sell but would have enough control over the process to choose their buyer. The political changes brought by Reconstruction provided additional opportunities for Elijah's plans. The temporary ascendancy of Republican governments in Virginia and the constitutional amendments guaranteeing civil rights for formerly enslaved people created an environment where a black man could, at least theoretically, participate in economic activities that would have been impossible before the war. Elijah used this window of opportunity to establish himself as a legitimate businessman, incorporating a trading company, opening accounts with multiple banks, and building relationships with white merchants who valued his reliability and business acumen more than they cared about his race. These business relationships served multiple purposes. They gave Elijah access to capital beyond what he could accumulate from his salary and trading profits, allowing him to make larger investments and to position himself as a potential purchaser of significant property. They also provided him with information about the broader economic situation in Virginia, including which plantations were failing, which properties were available for purchase, and what prices land was commanding in various transactions. Most importantly, they began establishing Elijah as a serious economic actor in Richmond's commercial community, someone who could be trusted to honor contracts and to conduct business according to accepted standards. By 1875, Elijah owned substantial property in his own right, including several commercial buildings in Richmond that he rented to businesses, agricultural land that he leased to tenant farmers, and significant holdings in a freight company that transported goods throughout Virginia. His total assets exceeded $60,000, making him one of the wealthiest black men in Virginia and richer than many white families who maintained pretensions of aristocratic status. Yet, he continued to live modestly, working as the Worthington Plantation's manager and maintaining the public image of a faithful former slave who had been rewarded with modest success for his loyalty and hard work. The tension between Elijah's public persona and his private reality required extraordinary discipline. He had to accept daily indignities from white society, enduring casual racism and condescending treatment from people who possessed a fraction of his wealth and intelligence. He had to watch Marcus Worthington drink away money that Elijah had helped generate, while being treated as a servant rather than the economic power he had become. But Elijah had learned patience from his mother, and he knew that revealing his true position too soon would destroy everything he had worked to accomplish. The opportunity Elijah had been waiting for came in 1878, when a combination of factors created the perfect conditions for acquiring the Worthington estate. A severe depression had struck the American economy in 1873, causing widespread bank failures and devastating agricultural prices. The Worthington Plantation, already burdened with substantial debt, found its revenue falling even as its obligations remained constant. By 1878, Marcus was unable to make even the interest payments on his loans, and Richmond banks were preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings that would force the sale of the entire estate. Elijah, who had been monitoring the plantation's deteriorating financial situation through his management role, approached Marcus with an offer that appeared to be a generous rescue, but was actually the culmination of 15 years of careful planning. He proposed to purchase the plantation's debts from the various creditors, consolidating all obligations into a single loan that would give the Worthingtons time to recover financially. The purchase price would be $70,000, covering all existing debts plus additional capital to make necessary improvements to the property. In exchange, Elijah would receive a mortgage on the entire estate, giving him the right to foreclose if payments were not made according to schedule. Marcus, facing the immediate loss of his family home and having no other source of capital, had little choice but to accept Elijah's offer. The transaction was structured carefully, with all documents prepared by Richmond attorneys and recorded in the county courthouse according to proper legal procedures. To white observers, it appeared to be an unusual but not unprecedented transaction, a successful black businessman helping his former master through financial difficulties. Few people understood that Elijah now held a legal claim on the Worthington estate that was more substantial than the family's own ownership interest. The mortgage agreement Elijah had crafted included terms that appeared generous on their surface, but which were actually designed to ensure eventual default. The interest rate was reasonable, but the payment schedule required the plantation to generate revenues that were unlikely given the depressed agricultural economy. More importantly, the agreement included provisions that allowed Elijah to assume direct control of plantation management if payments fell behind schedule, giving him the authority to make all operational decisions while the Worthingtons retained nominal ownership. Within 2 years, as Elijah had predicted, the Worthingtons were unable to meet their payment obligations. The agricultural depression continued, cotton prices remained low, and Marcus's continued spending on luxuries meant that whatever revenue the plantation generated was insufficient to service the debt. In 1880, Elijah exercised his right to assume management control of the estate, effectively becoming the plantation's operator, while Marcus and his family remained in residence as something between owners and tenants. This arrangement continued for nearly 9 years, during which the Worthingtons' legal ownership of their ancestral estate became increasingly theoretical. Elijah made all operational decisions, managed all finances, and gradually improved the property's condition through investments in equipment and infrastructure. The Worthingtons, meanwhile, lived in a strange liminal state, occupying rooms in a house they technically owned but did not control, supported by an allowance that Elijah provided as part of the management agreement. Marcus died in 1884, never having fully comprehended how completely his former slave had manoeuvred him into economic subordination. His death left the estate in the hands of his widow Catherine, whom Marcus had married in 1870, and their 2 sons, who were still minors. Catherine Worthington understood the family situation more clearly than Marcus ever had, recognizing that continued residence at the plantation depended entirely on Elijah's willingness to maintain the current arrangement. The final transfer of ownership came in 1889, when Catherine Worthington received an offer she could not refuse and could not accept without acknowledging the complete reversal of fortune that had occurred over the preceding decades. Elijah proposed to purchase the Worthington estate outright for $50,000, a price that was well below the property's nominal value, but far more than the family could hope to receive from any other buyer, given the debts and liens that encumbered it. The purchase price would provide Catherine and her sons with enough capital to establish themselves comfortably in Richmond, while finally resolving the ambiguous situation that had existed since Elijah assumed management control. Catherine spent weeks agonizing over the decision, not because she had any real alternative, but because accepting Elijah's offer meant publicly acknowledging that a man her dead husband had once owned as property now possessed the wealth and power to purchase the family's ancestral home. The social implications were devastating for a woman who had been raised to believe in the natural superiority of white Southerners and the permanent subordination of black Americans. But financial reality left her no choice, and in May of 1889, the transfer of ownership was completed in a Richmond courthouse, with all proper legal formalities observed. The sale of the Worthington plantation to Elijah Worthington, documented in deeds and contracts that were recorded in the county's official records, marked the completion of a 46-year journey from slave auction to property ownership. News of the transaction spread quickly through Richmond's white community, creating reactions that range from shocked disbelief to grudging admiration. Some saw Elijah's acquisition of his former master's estate as a disturbing symbol of the social changes brought by the Civil War and Reconstruction. Others recognized it as an impressive business achievement, acknowledging that whatever one thought about race relations, Elijah had demonstrated extraordinary financial acumen and patience in achieving his goal. The black community in Richmond and throughout Virginia celebrated the transaction as a powerful symbol of what was possible in the post-war South, though Elijah himself remained characteristically reserved about his accomplishment. On the day the deed transfer was recorded, Elijah Worthington stood in the master bedroom of the plantation house, looking out over land that he now legally owned. He thought about his mother, buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the property, who had extracted a promise from him to take everything from the Worthingtons without resorting to violence. He thought about the years of patience, the careful financial manipulations, the daily humiliations he had endured while working toward this moment, and he thought about what this achievement meant, not just for himself, but for the possibility of black economic power in a society still deeply committed to white supremacy. Elijah's story did not end with the purchase of the Worthington estate, but that transaction represented the culmination of the most extraordinary personal journey in Virginia's post-war history. He lived on the plantation for another 30 years, eventually expanding his holdings to include several other properties and businesses. He used his wealth to support education for formerly enslaved people, funding schools and scholarships that provided opportunities for advancement. He never married, never had children, and never spoke publicly about the methods he had used to acquire his former master's property. When Elijah died in 1919 at the age of 76, his will directed that the Worthington plantation be donated to a black educational institution, ensuring that land once worked by enslaved people would serve the descendants of those who had been held in bondage. The plantation house became a school, the fields were cultivated by students learning agricultural techniques, and the slave quarters were preserved as a memorial to those who had suffered there. The grave where Elijah's mother was buried was finally marked with a proper headstone, bearing her name and the inscription, "Delilah, free at last." This story raises profound questions about justice, revenge, and the meaning of success in a society built on systematic oppression. Elijah Worthington achieved something extraordinary, using intelligence and patience to accomplish what violence could never have delivered. He transformed himself from property to property owner, from slave to master, from powerless to powerful. But his success came at an enormous personal cost, requiring him to spend his entire adult life focused on a goal that consumed his energy and shaped every decision he made. Was it worth it? Did the satisfaction of owning his former master's estate compensate for the decades of patient manipulation, the daily indignities, the relationships he never formed, and the life he never lived outside of his campaign to acquire the Worthington property? These are questions that have no simple answers, and questions that continue to resonate in discussions about how formerly oppressed people should respond to the systems that have harmed them. What is undeniable is that Elijah Worthington's story represents a unique form of resistance to slavery and its aftermath, one that used the master's tools against the master's house, turning contracts and deeds and financial instruments into weapons more effective than any physical violence could have been. If you found this story as compelling as we did, make sure you've hit that subscribe button and turned on notifications. We have many more buried stories from American history waiting to be uncovered, stories that challenge what we think we know about our past and reveal the complexity of human experience in even the darkest times. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear about Elijah Worthington's extraordinary patience and triumph. Drop a comment below telling us what you think. Was Elijah's revenge justified? Was his success worth the personal cost? We want to hear your thoughts on this remarkable true story from America's hidden history. Until next time, remember that the past is never as simple as we're taught in school, and that resistance to oppression takes many forms, some violent, some patient, but all worthy of being remembered and understood.